What the government did was take that independence away, take that responsibility away, and force people. Straight away, they lose independence.
All of the mandates, as you say, in Victoria and Queensland were similar in that we have a Charter of Human Rights. If the government is going to limit one of those rights, then that limitation needs to be proportionate.
This was haphazard. It was slapped together. You're using a memo to back up breaching human rights. That's not going to cut it.
Hello and welcome to the Aussie Wire News, and today we're dedicating an entire episode to the Queensland Supreme Court's decision that vaccine mandates for emergency workers in Queensland were in fact unlawful and invalid. First, I'll speak with Senator Malcolm Roberts, the Senator for the people of Queensland, to get his thoughts and concerns about this decision. Then I'll speak with David Limbrick, MP from Victoria, about whether we can expect this decision in Queensland to have an impact in Victoria, where, like in Queensland, there is a Charter of Human Rights. And finally, I'll speak with regular correspondent Rebecca Barnett to discuss some of the other ongoing court cases around Australia and what we can look forward to going forward. All of that is coming up right now on the Aussie Wire News. Well, just a few days ago, we saw the bombshell news, the bombshell decision coming out of the Supreme Court of Queensland upholding a court case that was filed by emergency services workers who were saying that they should not have been coerced, they should not have been pressured into being vaccinated in order to keep their jobs. It's quite an extraordinary ruling. It comes on the back, of course, of a similar ruling out of New Zealand. Could the dominoes be beginning to fall? Well, here to talk with me about exactly that question is Senator from Queensland and for the people of Queensland, Malcom Roberts. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Topher. I love your work, mate.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate you taking time out of a busy schedule. You're actually in Parliament House right now. It is a sitting week, and we're very grateful you've given us a moment of your time. What's your initial impression of this decision?
Vindicated. The mood, and secondly, the mood has changed, Topher. We've noticed it here in the Senate, starting with the my motion that succeeded for drafting in terms of reference for future possible Royal Commission. Mm-hmm. That was one because the Greens and Labor Party were afraid to be seen to be opposing it. So we could tell. Plus, we know that there's a lot more awareness right throughout the community of injection injuries and deaths. That awareness is growing dramatically. People have lost trust in the health professions. They've lost trust in state and federal governments, and they want that trust back, and they want to be heard. So they're now starting to get really upset about this. I think that it's probably, you mentioned a point in the preamble that I wasn't aware of. So it's not perfect. And one significant aspect that you discovered is certainly a bit concerning. But at least it says that that the decision makers on the mandates were the Police Commissioner Carroll and John Wakefield, who's the Queensland Director General of Health. They did not take into account the workers' human rights.
Yeah.
Which is what we've been saying all along, you especially. And there's been no evidence that human rights had been considered. Therefore, he said the decision to mandate injections was unlawful. I mean, that's pretty startling.
It's pretty clear.
That's a really big takeaway.
It's pretty clear cut in that sense, and you've been one of the people pointing out from the very beginning the human rights implications of the decisions that were being made. This is where we see from the coverage in The Guardian, the court found the police commissioner, that's Katarina Carroll, failed to give proper consideration to human rights relevant to the decision to issue the vaccine mandate. That is pretty much as blunt as it gets. But you did allude to the fact that this, in my opinion, is not a perfect decision. We've seen some coverage by The Age here, and this hasn't received enough reporting, in my personal opinion, but not The Age, ABC News, but credit to ABC for covering this. Arguments were also made by the applicants about breaches of Section 17 of the Human Rights Act, which says people should not be subjected to medical treatment without full, free and informed consent. I mean, that's the Human Rights Act. It's also the Nuremberg trials and the outcomes of that. However, Justice Martin ruled that this human rights limit was reasonable when weighing all of the circumstances. I have to say, this precedent now at law certainly rings some alarm bells for me.
Yes, I agree with you, Topher. My belief is that most humans, or overwhelmingly, you could almost say all but a few humans, not a few percent, all but a few humans will do care for others. When push comes to shove, they're in a position, they will look after each other. And you can bet that, and you can rely upon humans, if the government tells them the truth, and they need something, and they should do something that they don't really want to do, but they will do it for the sake of others.
Yeah.
What the government did was take that independence away, take that responsibility away, and force people. Straight away, they lose independence. And they lose a sense of responsibility. So choice, wherever there's risk, there has to be choice. And wherever there's choice, there's responsibility. So the government is destroying its own citizenry, not just physically by the injection mandates and the health and even their lives, but it's destroying the will of the people, and it's destroying the responsibility of the people. So that the responsibility is one of the most important things you can have in a community.
Well, you used the word vindicated at the outset of this interview. You could forgive those involved in the court case for feeling, on the one hand, elated. They've had a relatively speaking positive outcome. On the other hand, this doesn't really restore back to them any of what was lost. And in the case of those that have endured a vaccine injury, they may not be able to get back what has been lost for them. What's the way forward from here? How do we begin to put this scrambled egg back together?
Well, I think Cara Thomas, I contacted her and Dee Abel, the nurse, and Dan McDonald, who's been outstanding in his leadership of the Fireys and forming a new union in Australia. I just said, this is wonderful news. And they shot back either, yes, it is. Now let's see what's going to happen. Yes, it is. Let's see the next steps. Yes, it is. But first we want to read the details. So they're all wary. They've got to unpick it. We do know, I was talking to a lawyer, we do know that there is a stay on disciplinary action, which means the past sackings cannot be enforced. That's my understanding, my advice. And no future disciplinary action can be taken. There can be no threats of sacking. We had nurses sacked in Queensland just 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
And this only applies at the moment, Topher, to those named in the class action as plaintiffs.
Sure.
So it's a precedent, though. It's not automatic, doesn't flow to everyone, yet it augurs well for the future. So I'm guessing that it will translate into other people calling for making appeals to courts. But I think also, speaking of appeal, it's possible that the state government will appeal it. I'm presuming there's a big cost. I don't know the number of plaintiffs, but if there's a big cost, the government might try to appeal it, because the decision was not made on the merit of the case; it was made on not following process. But I think it's going to be politically untenable for the Queensland government to appeal, because the people's mood has changed. As I said, I think they'd be smashed in the election, even with people who volunteered to get injected. And I think that we've seen that mood change in the Senate. We've seen that mood change in the community, and so I don't think the state government will be likely to appeal. But you never know, because Stephen Miles was the Deputy Premier when these COVID injections were implemented. He had been prior to that Health Minister, so he's in it up to his neck. So it's up to him what he wants to do, I guess. But hopefully he'll just roll over and just say, this is what the court said and let's get on with life.
Well, life, unfortunately, does not give you Hollywood moments very often. And this is not a Hollywood moment. It is a win. It's another brick in the wall that we are building and the structure that we are building, where ultimately we hope to be able to stand on that and hold people accountable. But I applaud your efforts, Senator Roberts.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I missed that. There's a division called and I had to...
Yeah. I was just signing off because I heard the bell.
If you could repeat that. No, it's fine. I don't have to go.
Okay. All right. I was just saying, this is part of the ongoing effort in order to be able to ultimately arrive at a place of accountability. And you've been one of the few people who's really been pursuing this from the very, very beginning. And I applaud your efforts and hope to see that maybe the tide is turning. Maybe this precedent in Australia now, we had one in New Zealand, we have one in Australia. Perhaps this is the beginning of accountability. You say, final question, you say that the mood is changing. Is there a resentment from those that clung on to the lie for so long, or are they really actually genuinely coming around? And can we expect them in the near future to begin supporting perhaps some justice?
Well, it depends, Topher. The people in the street, the members of the community, there's no resentment there. People who volunteered and to take the shots off their own free will, there's no resentment because they know the injuries are stacking up. So there's no resentment in the community. But where there is resentment and where there's plain fear and where there's stubbornness and digging in of heels is amongst the bureaucrats, the health bureaucrats and the politicians.
Sure.
pleasingly, One Nation was on the right side of this right from the start. Pauline and I called it out. Our state members called it out. The Liberals were on the wrong side. They implemented it. But in the Senate now, they're largely supporting us.
Yeah.
And the Liberals are showing encouraging signs. But the Labor Party, the Greens in particular, David Pocock, Jackie Lambie to some extent, they're still protecting the bureaucrats who caused this homicide. And it is homicide, Topher. I've checked with the lawyers before I said that. I've been saying it for a while. But the big people who are big defenders are the health bureaucrats. They just don't want to see anything. They don't want to look at anything. They just will not acknowledge anything. So what we're doing now is just dragging them kicking and screaming every time we get in front of them, Senate estimates, or we make a speech on this. We raise fundamental issues and we point to the homicide. And we point to this breach of trust being right through the TGA in terms of they're working for Big Pharma. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. The evidence points to that direction. They're not working for the people. They're in it for the industry. We had John Skerritt, Professor John Skerritt, former head of the TGA, head of the TGA when they approved these vaccines, these injections. 8 months later, he's on the board of Medicines Australia, which is the single pharmaceutical industry lobby. He's advising them on how to lobby to us. He's advising them on what to do. He's getting money from Big Pharma, the people who have been given an enormous open door with no competition, just two competitors, no competition from the masses, and they are going to have a whole new class of drugs based on mRNA. So that's a hell of a conflict of interest in my view. Less than 12 months after he made those decisions, after he was head of the TGA, and the TGA has been swung under his leadership, I believe, to be just a shill for the pharmaceutical industry. And so I could go on, but that's about it. They're digging in because I believe they're guilty.
Well, I think history is, I know that history is against them, and it seems that the tide is turning in other ways, and probably the sooner they jump ship, the better it's going to go for them. The longer they hang on, the greater their fall is going to be in the end. Senator Malcolm Roberts, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the work that you do in this regard, and I know that you're like a dog with a bone. You're not going to let go of this, and there's many Australians counting on you, so thank you so much for your work.
We're gonna hound these mongrels down, Topher.
Amen. Well, continuing our coverage of this Queensland decision and our analysis of what it does and does not actually mean in practice, I wanted to talk to someone from Victoria to get an idea of whether this precedent set in Queensland would have any utility in Victoria, given that Victoria also does have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Well, who better to talk to than David Limbrick MP, who, if you'll cast your mind back, has been one of those people who was good on COVID, on lockdowns, on all of these issues all the way through. He's not wise in hindsight. He was wise at the time, and he joins us right now on the Aussie Wire. David, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I do want to kind of take a brief excursion back into the past before we talk about this decision. And I've grabbed this picture here, which was one of the iconic pictures that came out of the COVID lockdown era. This is yourself, David Limbrick MP, joined by your colleague Tim Quilty MP, sadly no longer an MP, but he was amazing at the time along with yourself. Now, tell us what's happening here and what was the point you were trying to make in this particular moment during the pandemic?
Yeah, what happened here was another mandate from the government, a direction to shut down the parks because mums were being naughty. This was during lockdowns and we had curfews at the time, and lots of mums on their sort of, at the end of their tether were going down to the parks and being sneaky and doing evil things like having a coffee and talking to friends and letting the kids play in the parks.
For shame.
So they closed down the parks and we said, that was nuts, and we ended up camping out the front of Parliament and causing a lot of trouble. And I think the government stood on a landmine with this one and ended up rescinding that order in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't comply with that. I didn't used to take my kids to the park every day before they gave that order, but the minute they said I couldn't do it, we were heading down to 2 or 3 different parks every single day. My kids loved it. They thought it was the most fantastic time. Now, of course, this was right around the same time that the Victorian government also brought in a mandate for MPs to be vaccinated in order to come into Parliament House. The time when yourself and Tim Quilty, along with Catherine Cumming MP, went into the Parliament in exile. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so the government issued vaccine mandates for workers, but one of the things that they discovered was a limitation of the emergency powers was they couldn't actually mandate it for federal workers, parliament staff itself, and I think the judiciary. And so in order to do that, they had to put a motion through parliament, because parliament can make their own rules about themselves, to not allow MPs to take part in Parliament if they weren't vaccinated, or refuse to hand over their paperwork. Tim and I had been vaccinated, but we refused to hand over our paperwork. We were subsequently suspended from Parliament, and at the time you could do Parliament, you could take part remotely. And so we did that from a nightclub, Chase Lounge in the city, which was great because, of course, they were closed at the time. Great nightclub, by the way. And yeah, so that we made a big deal about that. We ended up handing over our paperwork after that, at the behest of many supporters, because the very next sitting week of Parliament was the pandemic bill. And if we had been out of Parliament for that, we wouldn't have been able to fight it.
Yeah. No, look, I think you made some really courageous decisions through there to make points where they were there to be made, and then to get on with business when the stakes were really that high. So I personally, coming from me, I applaud yourself and Tim and the way all of that was handled. Coming to this decision from the Queensland Supreme Court. Now, it is a bit of a mixed decision. Some people have gotten a bit too excited about the implications. Other people are simply trying to dismiss it and say that it really has no impact at all. From your perspective, you lived through all of those mandates that we just talked about, and so many more that we don't have time to talk about. What's the significance from your perspective of this Queensland Supreme Court decision?
Look, I think there's good news and bad news with it. All of the mandates, as you say, in Victoria and Queensland were similar in that we have a Charter of Human Rights. If the government is going to limit one of those rights, then that limitation needs to be proportionate. And my argument all throughout the pandemic is that I wasn't convinced of the proportionality of many of these things, including school closures, vaccine mandates, lockdowns, all of that sort of stuff. I wasn't convinced of the proportionality of any of it. And that was my argument all along, was around proportionality, whether it's a proportionate response.
Yeah.
Now, the decision in Queensland, there's two aspects that they're looking at. One is the proportionality, and one is whether it was administered correctly. And unfortunately, the decision looks like they've accepted that a vaccine mandate was proportionate, which I'm very disappointed about that conclusion that they came to. But the reason that the mandate was considered to be unlawful was because the health minister at the time, the CHO at the time, didn't provide evidence to the court that they'd actually considered the rationale for limiting that right. And the right under Victorian law, it's Section 10C of the Charter, which is the right to freedom from medical treatment without full and free consent. And Queensland has a very similar right. I can't remember the exact number it is in their charter, but that's a really important right. We have since done a lot of discussion about this in Victoria, and if you compare to international treaties like the UN Convention on the Charter of Human Rights, this particular right cannot be limited under international covenants. And so what we've actually already done in Parliament, and it's sitting on the notice paper in the Legislative Council, we put forward a private member's bill which makes it impossible to limit that right in any way whatsoever, which would actually have fixed this problem if that bill was active and was law. But I'm disappointed that the proportionality is a problem. So what does that mean for Victoria? If Victoria was not considering the human rights assessments, the human rights impacts, then it would be unlawful in Victoria. The problem is, I think that they actually were doing that work. In fact, I spoke with the CHO many times about it in my time on the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee. So I think that if a similar challenge under similar grounds was done in Victoria, it would probably be unlikely to find them unlawful, which I take no pleasure in saying that.
No.
But I think that's the reality. Yeah.
And we're not saying that we agree with the decision. We're simply trying to be honest about what the decision does or does not say. But I want to come back to this procedural aspect of it, because there is a particular test that I actually discussed with Tim Quilty when he was an MP during the pandemic in real time. I did a podcast with him, and I have some questions, having carefully read the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities myself as well. There is, of course, a provision. There's a clause in there that says that certain rights can be limited when they come into conflict with each other. And I think that that's a key phrase that has yet to be tested in Court. What was the human right within the Charter that was in conflict with the human right to be free of medical coercion? And I think that's a very difficult argument to make. As I've discussed it with a few different legal people, they tend to fall back on the right to not be infected with an infectious disease. But of course, there is no such right. And if we were to imply such a right, then that means that every single childcare centre is now a flagrant human rights violator. There's all kinds of novel problems that come up when you start to infer these previously non-existent human rights. So I don't think this is game, set and match. I don't think this is game over. I think there are arguments that have yet to be run here. I want to come back, though, to the impact of this decision, because regardless of the details of it, certainly it's been viewed by many, including Dr. Nick Coatsworth, who was on Sunrise just yesterday morning, talking about the fact that, in fact, the very first thing he said was, I want to acknowledge the role that I played in these vaccine mandates, and he was doing that by way of acknowledging that actually, according to this decision, he had been wrong. So regardless of the details, this decision is still going to have an impact, both at an official level and at a public perception level. Where do you think we're at with that? Do you think the public are coming around to the point where they're at least willing to acknowledge that perhaps we went too far?
Look, I think that there's a lot of people like that. I think a lot of people dug into their positions at the time. Maybe these, when you were talking about the conflict of rights, I think that's a really good discussion to have. And the conflict that they were looking at was the right to life, which is, the right of other people to not be harmed. Now, early on with the vaccines, people sort of assumed that they would prevent transmission, and maybe you could have made an argument, under that sort of science. But as we soon learnt, that it doesn't really prevent transmission much at all, and therefore that argument totally fell away. But people had already dug into their position, and they were very reluctant to move away from that. So I think that there are people moving away from the idea that we should have mandated these things, and I think that the harms of not necessarily deaths and things, but harms to things like, I've spoken to lots of women who've had problems with menstrual cycles and stuff like this due to vaccines. I think a lot of people are talking to their friends and realizing that, there was these other harms that weren't really considered. And a lot of people maybe feel bad about what happened and the way that it went down.
It's going to be interesting times for sure. We did see a decision out of New Zealand finding that vaccine mandates were unlawful. We've now seen a mixed decision to be sure, but a decision nevertheless that the vaccine mandates were on a technicality unlawful. That's going to have a tremendous impact for those who are still being denied their ability to work, etc., up in Queensland. And slowly we are seeing the needle turn. David, this is a challenging time because we're now trying to ask people that, as you say, dug into decisions that are now looking more and more questionable as time goes on. We're asking them to start to take some honest assessments of that. What's the pathway that you see towards any kind of justice, any kind of outcome where there might be some sort of an official acknowledgement, some sort of an official apology? We know in the past it's taken decades for governments to apologise for areas where they've flagrantly abused people's human rights. There were incidents with the gay community early on that took decades for the government to apologise for. There were issues with thalidomide that took decades. Are we on the same path here? Is it going to be decades before this really gets any official acknowledgement?
Look, I hope it's not decades. I think one of the important things is that I think that we need to provide people a pathway to change their position on these things. I think that one of the mistakes of many people, and maybe I'm guilty of this mistake as well, is sort of locking people with a different position into that and sort of not giving them a pathway to change to our position or to reassess the way that they were thinking. And so I think that that's really important. And I think it was really good what Dr. Coatsworth did in, providing a model for that pathway, right, in some ways. Yeah. And I think it's really important for us to do that and bring people along for the journey rather than sort of have this polarization still, which we had all the way throughout the pandemic. I don't think it's helpful to sneer at people who supported the mandates and things like that. Like many people did support them in good faith and thought that it was the right thing. And I think that we shouldn't demonize these people for those decisions or for those, especially members of the public. Yeah. We should give them a pathway to change their position.
Yeah. Well, certainly I'm hopeful that this decision, regardless of the mixed nature of it, is going to be continuing a pathway towards official acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. We'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, David Limbrick, MP, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.
Well, of course, many will be wondering what are the implications going forward of this mixed decision. And to discuss that with me right now is regular contributor and correspondent Rebecca Barnett. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Hey, good to be here. I'm burying myself in all the breaking info on this. It's a really exciting case. I'm keen to discuss.
Well,
what bits do you want to talk about?
Well, it's an interesting case. I mean, we've just heard from Senator Malcolm Roberts and then from David Limbrick MP with different aspects of it. We've addressed and acknowledged the fact that this is a bit of a mixed decision. The practical effect for those who actually brought the court case is that they've, in practical terms, had a win. The precedent value is somewhat limited. But I want to talk with you firstly about the fact that this is obviously not the only court case going on. We just saw a great result in South Australia that I'll get you to tell us a bit about. And is there value in just simply chipping away and this sort of chip? We haven't had a final win in this case. It wasn't what we would have liked to have seen, but is there still value in this?
Well, yeah, lawyers seem to think so because I think lawyers tend to play a long game and build case by case by case. And whenever I've talked to lawyers like Tony Nikolic or Peter Pham or Julian Gillespie, who are all very active in this space, they always seem to be of the view that every court case is, you're learning, you're improving, you're finding where the loopholes are, you're building admission on admission on admission, and who knows how long it will take. But it is encouraging to see these wins trickling through because, a couple of years ago, it just felt like we couldn't get a win anywhere.
Yeah.
And the judiciary seemed to be just assuming that if the government said safe and effective and proportional, then that must be the bottom line.
Yeah.
So we had the win in South Australia in the end of January. That was Daniel Shepherd. He won his workplace compensation claim. Essentially, the Department of Child Protection, which mandated his booster, was held liable for his injury of, I believe it was pericarditis. And so they now are responsible for the workers' compensation for that. And it was really encouraging in that particular decision that the judge said in the decision that they didn't think that when the parliamentarians brought in the mandates, the judge said, I don't assume that those parliamentarians meant for workers to not be compensated if they get hurt. The judge said a rational assumption would be that that it was the intent of the parliamentarians that if anyone did get hurt, that they would be properly compensated under normal workplace law. So that was encouraging because prior to that, we've seen some judgments that don't seem to be particularly rational or kind of don't seem to follow common sense. So that was encouraging.
It's interesting to me to reflect, and you mentioned obviously not so long ago, the chance of a successful court case of this nature was basically zilch. And now we're seeing cracks appearing. And yes, it's this particular decision from Queensland, I would argue, is a technical decision. I don't think it was won on the merits that it should have won on, in my personal opinion. But it was a win for the people that brought the case. But it's worth reflecting on the fact that we're only 2 years out from these mandates really coming in force, 2.5 years, depending on exactly where you draw that line. And it's worth thinking about the road ahead and taking that longer view, as you mentioned, that lawyers often take. Where do you think this leads in 5 to 10 years?
Well, Clive Palmer said that he would be interested in potentially funding a class action. So, we know he likes to stir the pot. So if he can do that by funding a few more legal suits, I'm sure he will. I think this is such a non-answer, but it remains to be seen. I was encouraged by the fact that in the decision for this Supreme Court Queensland decision, I hate using the word decision, apologies, but in the decision, the judge said that the evidence had not been sufficient for the mandates that were brought in. The judge referred to footnotes being used or memos being used, saying that, well, this has clearly been taken out of context. And the upshot was this was haphazard. It was slapped together. You're using a memo to back up breaching human rights. That's not going to cut it. Yeah. So even though the judge didn't say you can't breach human rights, which is unfortunate, at least what we got from this decision was if you want to breach human rights, you've got to put a bit more effort in. You've got to actually have references that make sense and are in context. at one point he said that the modelling that they'd relied on was nothing of the sort, that they did not properly consider the human rights ramifications. So that's encouraging to me, that if the government or employers want to do something as drastic as vaccine mandates again, they're going to have to put a lot more work into it. They're going to actually really have to, make a show, which, that in a sense it's not encouraging, because they'll probably just go through the motions. But it does mean that it will add to the effort to bring in these mandates, and it will slow the process down, because they'll have to actually find evidence. They can't just go off the cuff like they did last time. So I think that is an outcome that's probably beneficial in a limited sense, that it will slow everything down, and it will give employers and governments pause, that they'll at least have to put more work into it if they want to do something so extreme going forward.
Well, that's the legal side of it. What impact do you think this is going to have from a public perception and public awareness side of it? I mean, I was just chatting with David Limbrick, MP, about Dr. Nick Coatsworth coming on to the morning show and kind of giving a limited mea culpa and acknowledging his own involvement in the pushing of the vaccine mandates and so forth. It was certainly a long way short of any sort of an apology, but it was a shift from what we've seen from someone like Dr. Nick Coatsworth in the past. Do you think that this decision might have a disproportionately outsized public perception impact in spite of its limited legal impact?
Maybe, but I hate to be a pessimist,
Sure.
but I think that what I learned from the pandemic period was that people are very susceptible to fear, and that by and large, Australians still like to be told what to do, and they like rules. And so even though I think that the number of people who are happy to just suck it up and be scared witless by fear and just do as they're told has shrunk, I still think it's the majority. So I think my take on it is that if the government wants to do this again, they just need a bigger threat. They just need something twice as scary or 5 times as scary. I also think that the WHO pandemic treaty and international health regulation amendments are an example of the kind of thing that give the government more cover to do this kind of thing again, but seemingly with the blessing of the global oracles that issue edicts that we all follow. So yeah, does that make sense? I don't want to be a total pessimist.
Yeah.
I just think that at the same time there are other counterforce. So yes, this was a good force in this direction, but there are also counterforces happening in this direction, and they probably at the moment cancel each other out.
Well, you're a bundle of joy, a real ray of sunshine into this situation. No, but hey, we've got to be real. We've got to be real about it. And you're not wrong. The World Health Organization and the international the new pandemic regulations are very, very concerning. And you're absolutely right. They will get used by local politicians, by Australian politicians, as cover, as an excuse to then carry out whatever it is that they want to do next time around. But there are other court cases ongoing in Australia as well. There are people pushing back on different aspects. And there is, of course, the liability aspect, which we touched on with that South Australian court case, where obviously the pharmaceutical companies have made deals with the government to say, well, we're not liable for anyone that gets harmed. The employers thought that they weren't going to be liable, and the government has certainly been careful to make itself not liable. And now all of a sudden the employers are finding out, oh, hang on, we are liable. So these court cases can still have...
the middle.
Yeah. So what are some of the other cases going on? I know these things can take a very, very long time, but just remind us of what else is in this landscape at the moment that we can look forward to at some point in the future.
Yeah, so there's that case that's in the federal court at the moment about the GMO status of the mRNA vaccine. So Dr. Julian Fidge, who's a Victorian pharmacist and doctor, he's seeking an injunction to stop the vaccines from being distributed in Australia on the basis that they're GMOs or contain GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and that those have been not properly approved by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. Now, the inference there is if they contain GMOs that are produced with gene technology, then by deduction, they're a gene therapy. So there's a lot riding on this for the OGTR, which is the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, to fight this tooth and nail, because if they lose, it kind of has a lot of knock-on effects for them.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that in the paper that, oh, this gene therapy wasn't properly approved. So we yet to see, I mean, that's been filed. We yet to see any development with that because these things are slow and take forever.
Sure.
But we know that the Office of there was actually a really interesting slip of the tongue. Dr. Raj Bueller, who's the head of the OGTR, said in the Senate late last year in a hearing, she admitted that gene technology had been used in making the mRNA vaccines. But then she said, caveat, because they weren't manufactured here, they're not under our purview and they didn't need an approval with us. Now, that runs counter to the OGTR's own documents. That runs counter to what the Gene Technology Act actually says. So we'll see what happens with that court. There's also the class action that Dr. Melissa McCann is running. And again, that's been filed, but the machinations are now in progress. And again, it's slow. They've got over 1,000 members. And there's a second class action in the works that I know of as well that has not yet been filed, but is in the development stage. And the difference between those two class actions is whereas Mel McCann's is targeting particularly the more like the federal health minister, chief medical officer, CMO, the TGA saying, you shouldn't have approved this or you didn't go through the proper processes. The class action that's in development, which is also seeking to enroll thousands of injured Australians, is going to be targeting state CHOs and premiers, which I think there's a lot of appetite amongst people who are injured for that, because for them, the people who mandated them were the state leaders and the people who got on the television and told them they were an idiot if they didn't, or that they're an anti-vaxxer for saying they got hurt. They were the state figures. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that one develops. I think by the end of the year, we should see that one filed.
Yeah, the tragedy is you're not wrong. These things do take a very long time. They take an enormous amount of money. I mean, just the criminal charges that they held over my head took 2.5 years to play out, and that was an incredibly basic court case in comparison to any of this stuff. The process is the punishment, unfortunately, and I think what's important is that we take the wins that we can get, as mixed as they may be, as imperfect as they may be, and we just acknowledge the fact that as time passes, we are going to be able to get more and more wins, and we are going to get more and more acknowledgements of the wrong that was done. And if we don't give up, we may eventually get to the point where we can actually get a proper acknowledgement of what was done and maybe even some accountability. But if we do give up, then of course we'll never get there. So it's a matter of just persevering. Well, Rebecca Barnett, sorry.
I know I sound pessimistic, but when I said before that it's like one thing's kind of, there's a force in this direction with the win and then there's counter forces. I think the importance of these wins is if you don't have any counter force, you just get flattened.
Correct.
So I don't want to sound like I don't think it's a great thing. I 100% do. I'm just also mindful that it doesn't necessarily mean that, now we're just going to win court cases left, right and centre and this will never happen again.
Yeah, and it certainly hasn't set a precedent that's going to transform things elsewhere in Australia. Look, here at the Aussie Wire, we're all about truth, freedom and hope. We're never going to sell you false hope. We're always going to tell you the truth. And the truth is, this is a good result for the individuals that brought the court case. It's a mixed result for everybody else. We're not even sure necessarily whether this precedent is going to help the types of healthcare workers that were also mandated that weren't parties to the court case. So we've got to wait and see a lot of those details. As always, we'll stay across this story. We'll stay up to date with this and any other court cases that arise. And Rebecca Barnett, thank you so much for joining us on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com, follow all our socials via @theaussiewire, and become an insider. That's a financial supporter of the Aussie Wire at the link in the description. Our insiders help us to keep bringing you the news based on truth, freedom, and hope. And I certainly hope that today's episode, you've learnt some truths, you can sense that freedom is rising, and that it's given you some hope. Because I think there are many good things that lie ahead of us. Challenges to overcome, yes, but many good things ahead. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.